Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mini Projects Research Dissemination. My name is Namita Singh, and I'm the Director of Knowledge and Innovation Hub at Digital Green. So the Market Intervention for Nutritional Improvement, or the Mini Project, is an international research program which has been co-funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Mini aims to understand the opportunities, challenges, and trade-offs of aggregation and market intervention projects and their ability to impact the availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables in markets that serve nutritionally vulnerable consumers in Bihar, India, and Jessore district, Bangladesh. A segment of Mini also examines poultry market interventions in Ghana. But today, we'll mostly be sharing the observations and findings from our research in Bihar, India, and we'll also be including some experiences from other parallel settings to broaden the context. The Mini project is led by researchers of the University of Sheffield, the International Livestock Research Institute, Vietnam, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Bangladesh Agriculture University, Lincoln University, New Zealand, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and Digital Green. So before we jump into it, there's some announcements in terms of housekeeping. Please note that we will be recording the webinar. We will share the recording with all of you after the webinar. We've got your email IDs from the registration. We'll be disabling the chat function, but right now you can use it in case of any technical problems. Any questions that you need to ask, you can ask using the Q&A box, and we will keep an eye out on the questions you raise. And we'll bring them to the speaker's attention when we come to the discussion, the Q&A session. Some of the speakers may answer your questions in the Q&A box itself. We will have three parts to the presentations today. The first would be focusing on the horticulture system of Bihar and the headline findings from the Mini project with regards to making aggregation schemes and their food systems more nutritionally sensitive. The second will be providing insights from a number of related food system studies on horticulture, food loss, production clusters in Orissa, and poultry aggregation systems in Ghana. And the third would be the Q&A session to address any questions that emerge from the presentations delivered. We've got several speakers, but we will also have time for discussion at the end of this 2-hour webinar. We'll be launching some posts throughout the webinar, so please stay tuned for those and participate in those as well. We might not be able to answer all the questions since we've got like several attendees, but we'll do our best. And you can also give a thumbs up and comments on the questions that others ask. And in case there are questions that we're unable to answer today, we will be sure to follow up with you. So before we dive into the discussions today, we'd like to take a quick poll. So please take a moment to respond to the 2 questions that we're just putting up on the screen. So can we launch the poll, please? We've still got a few seconds, so would request those of you who have not filled the poll to please do so. Okay, so we had pretty simple questions. Can people see the poll results? Can anyone confirm they can see the poll results?
Yep, I can see the poll results.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so one, of course, we wanted to understand who our audience is. So it seems like a lot of researchers plus NGO staff here, some technical specialists and others as well. So great to have a mix in the audience as well. And yeah, seems like most of the areas that we've put out here are of interest. So hopefully the presentations would be able to touch upon most of these aspects, the food and vegetable sector, nutrition, aggregation, etc. So hopefully we'd be able to keep piquing your interest throughout. So now I'd actually like to invite Dr. Nadagowda. Dr. S.B. Nadagowda comes from a background of veterinary science with a post-graduation in rural management from IRMA. He has worked in the cooperative business and development sector for more than 3 decades. He's been with Digital Green since its inception and has also been serving as a national resource person for the Ministry of Rural Development at the National Rural Livelihood Mission as well. So over to you, Dr. Nadagowda.
Yeah, thanks, Namita, for your brief introduction. In fact, I'll just start with the introduction to the digital green itself. Many people might be knowing that, in very simple terms, digital green's work focuses on bringing together the strengths of our grassroots level partners and technology for rural farming communities around the world. How do you know that what's appropriate? It's very simple. We listen closely to the people and to the data also. Then we build the technology that's of the community and for the community. Now, let us come to the loop. What is loop? And we observed that although smallholder farmers produce a large portion of the world's food supply, that they very often live in poverty and they are malnourished as well. They buy the inputs at a very high retail prices and sell the produce at the low wholesale rates, missing out on the potential gains when dealing in bulk. So the problem is augmented for horticulture farmers, given the crops perishable in nature, which increases the dependence on the local middlemen, money lenders, and the market as the farmers struggle against the time to sell their harvested produce before it rots. And most smallholder farmers face several factors that combine to create lower net margins for their primary cash producing livelihood activity. They deal with the low volumes that prevent from the tapping into the cost savings and better pricing that comes with the economies of the scale. They lack adequate, up-to-date kind of information on pricing, which hinders their ability to identify the accessible market offering the higher prices for their perishable produce. They spend anywhere from half to a full day traveling to the market, absorbing the high opportunity cost for low returns. They pay high transportation costs relative to their small individual load size, which eats into their earnings margin. In a very short video, we'd like to show you that the tech-enabled solution we developed, which is called Loop. Shall I request Shiny to play the video now? Shiny. Thanks, Shaini. Loop, as you saw in this video, is a shared transport service initiated to benefit the small and marginal vegetable farmers. Started in Bihar and extended to other states in India, Bangladesh, using the technology solutions. So Loop is AI-based vehicle and market optimization to realize the better prices for the vegetables. And DG has worked with around 25,000 farmers and has benefited the farmers to reduce the transportation costs by around 45% through aggregation and 29% increase in price realized through the arbitrage activities. And it is worthwhile to mention that farmers have saved about 4 to 6 hours of time per market trade, and saved time has been utilized for other agricultural activities. Okay. So now coming to the mini research. So we know that the aggregation schemes such as Loop are great at organizing and transporting the fruits and vegetables. However, they tend to favor larger urban markets due to their sizes and prices. Therefore, the mini project, research project, has been looking at the ways in which the aggregation and the wider food system may be adopted to improve the availability of fruits and vegetables in a smaller, more rural markets, whilst at the same time protecting the revenues of the farmers. Okay. So now where we have implemented, like let me have the opportunity to introduce Jivika. Given the size of the challenges facing us, it is important to understand the overarching context of the horticulture system in Bihar. And the work of the Bihar Rural Livelihoods Promotion Society, and we are expecting to have with us, we were expecting to have with us, sorry, our CEO of Jivika, Mr. Balamurugan, today to share his observations. However, we have been informed by his office that he is in home quarantine, and some of the family members of his family have been affected with COVID. So he would be unable to join us, but our prayers are with him and his family and the Jivika team itself. So our partnership with Jivika in Bihar has initiated from 2012 onwards, and we have been working in almost all the 38 districts of Bihar with them. When we initiated the Loop service in 2016, it could not have been possible without the support of the leadership as well as the staff of Jivika. So on behalf of the Digital Green team, I would like to thank Jivika for their unwavering support throughout these many years. Okay. So this is a kind of a like an intro. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Nadagoda. And I think everyone understands the challenges that people are facing today, everyone who's affected by COVID. And on behalf of the mini team, we wish them a speedy recovery. Moving on, to make sure that we keep our messages clear and also the webinar within the allotted time, we've pre-recorded some of the presentations by the researchers. However, we have all of our research team with us on this webinar. So please post your questions in the Q&A box as you go through the presentations. Coming up now is a pre-recorded presentation by the Principal Investigator, Professor Bhavani Shankar. Bhavani Shankar is a professorial research fellow in food systems and health at the Institute for Sustainable Food, University of Sheffield, and is principal investigator for the mini project. He is an applied economist working on research areas at the intersection of food systems, nutrition, health, and sustainability. His current research interests include food markets and nutrition, equity in food systems, and nutrition sustainable diets, and food and nutrition policy evaluation. A native of Chennai, he studied at the University of Madras and Jawaharlal Nehru University before obtaining a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Shankar will explain the background to the mini project and describe some initial insights from the research.
Hi, everyone. Glad you could be with us today. My name is Bhavani Shankar, and I'm Principal Investigator for the mini project. Now, we know that fruit and vegetable intakes are absolutely vital for human nutrition and health. Not only because they're key sources of micronutrients, the essential vitamins and minerals that are so critical for human growth and human functioning, but also because they have a key role to play in lowering the risk of cardiovascular disease and some cancers. Now, India is fighting a rising tide of diet-related chronic disease, and fruits and vegetables are a key ally in that fight. But the problem is, the Indian population is highly deficient in the intake of fruits and vegetables. If you look at the NSSO data, which are a bit old now, we find that the average intake in the population was about 200 grams per person per day. Now, the World Health Organization's norm is for 400 grams per person per day, so we're quite a long way away from where we need to be. If we take Bihar, which is the area of focus for this project, the situation is even worse, at 132 grams per person per day. And not only are these average intakes low, but the fruit and veg intake in the Indian population is also quite unequally distributed. If you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, it shows the histogram of fruit and vegetable intakes in the population. We can see that there are significant proportions of the population with very low intake. That's quite worrying. Now, the mini project's point of departure for how the situation could be improved is to analyze food markets as a mechanism for delivering fruits and vegetables equitably and efficiently to the population. Why this focus on markets? First of all, India, like many other rapidly growing countries, is urbanizing rapidly, and the proportion of non-farm population is increasing quite steadily. So in coming decades, we'll have to find a way to deliver more nutritious foods to this increasing non-farm segment. Secondly, the poorest people are often landless with no prospect of growing fruits and vegetables for themselves, and so they're quite market dependent. Also, markets are inherently scalable, considering that they emerge from a human instinct to buy and sell and transact. So the big question is, can we shape these markets to deliver nutritious foods more efficiently and equitably? And finally, even if we are interested specifically in the nutrition of smallholder farmers, note that they're often net buyers from the market. They actually buy more food from the market than they sell. They will sell during times of plenty and buy back from the market in the lean periods. So these are all reasons for seeking to leverage markets to deliver nutrition. So Mini's research is based on this understanding that improving market availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables is absolutely key. And in Mini, we focus on aggregation as a market intervention to increase fruit and vegetable supply to the market. As we know, aggregation, especially in horticulture, is becoming very popular around the world. And this is also happening in India with the formation of farmer-producer organizations and so on. Aggregation involves organizing farmers to do collective marketing, collective transportation, collective selling to traders at markets. And in India, Digital Green's Loop aggregation scheme has been a great innovator in the space since 2016 or so. What does Loop involve? Well, essentially, Loop involves an aggregator visiting participating villages and farmers on a regular basis, picking up the produce, organizing collective transportation to the mandi, doing collective bargaining with the gadidars and traders, and once the vegetables have been sold, to relay the payments back to the farmers with digital receipts. So Mini research is asking, using Loop as our case study, what are the implications of aggregation for availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables in nutritionally vulnerable markets? We train special focus on nutritionally vulnerable markets in the sense of smaller, not very lucrative, perhaps neglected markets, which are especially relevant from an equity perspective. Markets in small towns, semi-rural, semi-urban areas, for example. And then, once we study this, we ask, how can aggregation be made more equitable and more nutrition sensitive? To answer these questions, we have a study structure that can be divided into two parts. In the first part, we carry out a value chains assessment using some very rich transaction-level daily data from Loop, a survey of the literature, and a series of semi-structured interviews and focus group discussions that we did that involved the entire range of actors along the value chains, farmers, aggregators, gadidars, traders, and so on. In the second part of our study, we carry out modeling based on system dynamics, where we capture the value chain actors and the relationships between them, all of this set in the context of the fruit and vegetable marketing system in quite a bit of detail. This modeling work is informed not only by the value chains assessment, but also data from a household survey that we did along the value chain, in which we collaborated with the Center for Media Studies in Delhi. Also, we carried out a series of group model building exercises to inform the model, where the model was developed in a participatory fashion with farmers, aggregators, and other value chain actors. You'll be hearing much more about the modeling in the next presentation. So let's talk a little bit more about our value chains assessment. In this diagram, we capture a composite picture of the fruit and vegetables value chain within which Loop is embedded. The main Loop segment of the value chain is shown in yellow, and the non-Loop or the conventional strands are indicated using gray shaded boxes and the dotted lines. So we see from this that the Loop aggregator picks up from the farmers, the product is then transported to the market, and then at the vegetable mandi or the market, quite often, especially at the larger mandis, there will be a commission agent or a gadidar acting as an intermediary between the selling party and the buying parties, for example, wholesalers or retailers. Quite often in the larger mandis, a lot of the product will be bought up by distance traders with large trucks who may move the produce to other states, quite often to consumers in large urban areas, or even across the border to Dhaka or Kathmandu. In the smaller mandis or haats, the produce is more likely to go to local consumers via small traders or retailers. In the non-Loop part of the value chain, in the gray boxes, farmers essentially have to rely either on farm gate or village traders or organize their own sale to the market. Now, does aggregation benefit the farmers? Definitely yes, both in terms of net returns from the market sale, as well as in terms of time savings. Now, this diagram here shows where the aggregated produce goes to for the case of Bhojpur district in Bihar. In this diagram, the circles are Loop villages, and the triangles are mandis. And the larger the triangle, the larger the mandi size and the capacity to absorb produce. The colored lines show the movement of produce from villages to a particular mandi. For example, the pink lines are showing movement towards Ara Mandi, which is a large mandi in the city of Ara, and a hub for distance traders to various other large cities. As we can see from the picture, fruits and vegetables are coming into Ara from villages located quite far away in Bhojpur. And in many cases, those aggregations are choosing to bypass smaller mandis en route to get to the larger mandi in Ara and sell there. So a key thing that we are seeing emerging from the value chains assessment is a large market pool that is prominent in aggregation and collective marketing. When collective transport lowers transportation costs, there's an incentive to seek out the larger and more lucrative markets, typically in larger cities, to serve those city populations or to be bought up by distance traders, push the produce out to faraway areas with good purchasing power. So, some thoughts to close this presentation. We're used to thinking about horticultural interventions mostly from a farmer perspective. And that is important without a doubt. But there's a need to start thinking about leveraging markets to make fruits and vegetables available more equitably to consumers. Fruits and vegetables are a vital part of the nutrition puzzle, and there's no public distribution system to rely on for equitable provision. Our results show that aggregation is a powerful intervention in terms of what it can offer farmers, but it is also prone to large market pull, which raises questions about equity in consumption across space. So how can we improve equity and nutrition sensitivity in this scenario? Would it make sense to do this internally within aggregation schemes? For example, subsidizing transport to smaller markets, or setting aside a quota for smaller markets? Or do we need external reinforcement in the form of government policy to tackle this? And this is something we'll hear about more in the next presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavani, Professor Bhavani. Next up, we have a pre-recorded presentation by the postdoctoral research fellow on the mini project, Dr. Gregory Cooper, who's been modeling the future scenarios and interventions that may help to increase the availability of fruits and vegetables in relatively small markets in Bihar, while at the same time promoting the revenues of aggregating farmers. Dr. Cooper is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Food at the University of Sheffield. He's been the postdoctoral researcher on the mini project since spring 2018, spending 3 years at the Center for Environment Development Policy at the School of Oriental and African Studies prior to Sheffield. His research focuses on developing systems models to identify nutrition-sensitive market interventions in India. He holds a PhD in geography from the University of Southampton. His presentation will focus on the modeling work done for the mini project and the implications of results. So can we have the presentation now?
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the second presentation of the Mini Project's Virtual Dissemination Workshop. My name is Greg Cooper, and I'm the postdoctoral research fellow on the project. And for the next 10 minutes or so, I want to describe some of the key results and implications coming from the systems dynamics modeling element of the work, where we have been looking at the scenarios and potential interventions to increase the availability of fruits and vegetables in relatively small peri-urban markets in Bihar, whilst at the same time avoiding significant trade-offs on the market participation and profits of farmers involved in aggregation. So just to introduce the approach which we have taken in this part of the project, we have used a modeling technique known as systems dynamics modeling, which allows the groups of people and the flows of fruits and vegetables, finance and information to be represented as a series of stocks, flows and feedbacks. And this is really useful because the structure of the value chain, everyone from the farmers who produce fruits and vegetables, down through the transportation and marketing, and all the way down to the retail customers, they can be incorporated into the structure of the model. In turn, systems modeling allows for participatory approaches, and we can see here Vinay Rana, formerly of Digital Green, speaking with commission agents and traders and farmers in Bhojpur district, and trying to understand more about the feedbacks and the delays which they consider when they try to decide which market to send the produce to. And through spatial group model building, which was developed by Dr. Carl Rich, who is part of the mini project, we've been able to map some of these across space and also kind of causal loop diagrams to help understand the different drivers of these market supplies and whether farmers are involved in aggregation. In turn, systems modeling is important because we're able to run different scenarios where you make changes in the model to understand, what happens downstream within the model. What are the impacts of, say, scaling up aggregation in participation in aggregation up to 5,000 farmers, say by over the course of 10 years? What will be the impact on the delivery of fruits and vegetables, within the model? So, with this in mind, just to give a brief overview of the model structure, the model is based upon Kulwa block in Bhojpur district, which has a population of horticultural farmers of around about 12,000. And these farmers have to decide whether or not they want to join the aggregation scheme. And the way they do this is by considering their expected profits and their expected ability to sell produce to the market by being part of the aggregation scheme over the next production season. And in turn, on any given day, the farmers have to consider whether or not to send their produce when they have it ready to be marketed through the aggregation scheme, or they may want to go alone to the market and potentially incur higher transportation costs, for example. And then the farmers can send the aggregators to one of two markets, or one or two market environments. The first is a large wholesale-oriented market with a daily capacity of around about 130 to 150 tons during the peak production season. And this is based upon Ara and Kaimnagar markets in Bhojpur district. Or alternatively, the produce could be sent to a cluster of small, more retail-oriented markets, which have a daily capacity of around about 20 to 25 tons when combined. And importantly, both of these markets serve consumer populations who purchase fruits and vegetables for home consumption, depending on the price of the fruits and vegetables in the market on any given day. And of course, we are interested in the scenarios which can help to increase the availability of fruits and vegetables in the smaller retail market, whilst at the same time avoiding significant trade-offs on the participation and the profits generated by farmers in the aggregation scheme. And I'd really encourage anybody who is particularly interested in the model details and documentation, and also the techniques we use to validate the model, to perhaps read this paper here, which we published this year in Agricultural Systems. But now just really to describe some of the key takeaways from the modeling work. What you can see here is actually the types of time series which the model produces. So here on the left-hand side, we see the average profits of all farmers within the model, so combining both loop and non-loop. And you see the seasonality here over the course of 10 years. And here on the right-hand side, we see the volume of fruits and vegetables purchased by consumers within the smaller retail market. And what we see here is a trade-off. We see the red line here that actually when we increase participation in the aggregation scheme up to 5,000 farmers over 10 years, we see an increase in the average profits of farmers through better access to the larger market and reduced transportation costs. However, we then see a reduction in the actual purchases of fruits and vegetables made by retail consumers in the smaller market under this scaling scenario, relative to the baseline, which is the black line here, where we basically do nothing to the model and we allow the aggregation scheme to scale up naturally, and there are no other interventions within the model. So what we see here is an actual trade-off between increased profits but reduced flows of fruits and vegetables to the smaller market. But of course, this was only a two-dimensional trade-off. And of course, there are other dimensions we may be interested in. So what we have done is design a trade-off wheel, which takes into account 6 different outcome dimensions. And we're then able to look at the direction of change, the magnitude of change, and the significance of change relative to the baseline simulation, where we do nothing to the model. So to begin with, we have 2 consumer-facing outcomes here, the price and the purchases of fruits and vegetables in the smaller retail market. We then have 2 farmer-facing outcomes, the average loop, or the farmers who are part of aggregation, their average market profits, and then the profits of all farmers within the model, because we don't want to forget about non-loop farmers. And then also 2 outcomes here which look at the relative profitability of the aggregation scheme. And then and finally the last one here keeps track of the amount of commission generated by the aggregation scheme, basically, which tends to suggest higher participation, higher sales of fruits and vegetables through aggregation. And what you'll see for the different scenarios, these different segments will change in their shape and their color, where the more blue the color is, the better the outcome is for that dimension. The more red it is, the worse the outcome. And the darker the color, the more significant the average changes in that scenario relative to the baseline. So here, for example, this is the trade-off wheel which occurs under the scaling up scenario if we increase farmers up to 5,000 in the aggregation scheme over 10 years. And what we see here is a significant increase in all farmer profits, as we said, about the increased market access and lower transportation costs. However, with fruits and vegetables being diverted away from the smaller market towards the large urban market, we see a significant decline in the affordability and the availability of produce in these smaller markets, which is detailed here. In contrast, we could subsidize aggregating farmers to send their produce to the smaller markets. We could pay for 50% of the transportation costs, for example. And what we see here is only marginal increases in the availability and affordability of the produce in the smaller markets. And basically, this is because the larger urban market still remains so attractive and powerful that actually only around about 5% of farmers switch their produce to the smaller market. So actually we need to go beyond simply offering a financial incentive if we want to make real change within the system. For example, we could send 20% of produce aggregated on any given day to the smaller markets. Essentially, what this does is saturate the smaller market environment, and we get significant improvements in the availability and purchases of fruits and vegetables. However, the farmers, generate lower profits due to, poorer prices and higher chances of wastage in the market, and also the actual kind of attractiveness of being part of aggregation also reduces, which leads to lower participation. In turn, we could introduce small-scale 10 metric ton cold storage facilities in the smaller market, which can store fruits and vegetables up to a maximum of 21 days. And what we see here is cold storage essentially helps traders to build up a buffer against low supplies, and also helps them to cut wastage during the main Rabi production season. And we see then this helps to dampen prices and increase purchases by consumers within the smaller market. But also it's important to remember that these scenarios do not have to be standalone. Actually, we can combine these scenarios to perhaps maximize consumer-facing outcomes whilst avoiding trade-offs. So, for example, this scenario here only sends produce to the smaller market if traders in the smaller market contact the aggregation scheme and tell them they have a supply shortage. What we see is a marginal increase in the availability and the affordability of produce in the smaller markets. But actually the changes are not significant. And this is because actually the demand in these markets is not big enough to actually attract enough produce over to the market. In turn, if we actually increase the demand that consumers have for this produce by 5% each year, at a given price, if we actually increase their purchasing capacity, essentially, then we're able to then generate significantly better availability and purchases in the smaller market, as now the aggregation scheme is now sending relatively large volumes to the smaller market, which is then purchased and for consumption. And in turn, if we then introduce cold storage and also reduce transport costs to the smaller market, we're able to maximize the changes in the purchases, or the increase in the purchases of fruits and vegetables in the smaller market, whilst avoiding all significant trade-offs for farmers and participation in the aggregation scheme. And really just to leave you for the last 30 seconds with some of the key takeaways, and just to say that we find that aggregation schemes can be potentially very powerful tools and platforms to increase market participation and coordinate supplies and increase market fruits and vegetables deliveries to different markets. But decision makers and policy makers must remember that trade-offs may occur, and it's not simply a case of just sending more produce to smaller markets. And actually, perhaps policymakers should focus not only on improving participation in aggregation, but also providing conditions such as cold storage, better market infrastructure, transport infrastructure, to help generate some more of the conditions which support and sustain supplies to the smaller markets, reducing food loss and wastage in the smaller markets, and also help to stimulate demand for this produce within the smaller market. So I hope that's been interesting, and I really look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that presentation. I'd now like to welcome Professor Bhavani Shankar, Dr. Cooper, and Dr. Nadabora to respond to some of the questions that have been posed by the attendees. We'll have 10 minutes for that. Please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box as well. But just before they begin, let's take this quick poll to see how important you think it is for us to work towards getting more attention to the subject of nutritionally sensitive food systems and interventions. Can we launch the poll, please? So I think, of course, an overwhelmingly large number of people agree that greater policy support is needed for consumer nutrition-focused value chain interventions. Perhaps something to dig deeper into as the Q&A is taken up. I think Bhavani can probably answer the one question from Devesh Roy, which says, and his point is that aggregation models, in spite of all the noise about them, their performance is extremely subpar. And they've not got the incentives right, affected by a lot of negative selection and agency problems. And you can look around and count the success stories, and you need to understand why so many fail and have not scaled up. Take it to the real world, give easy finance for 3 years, as NABARD does, and several FPOs come up with life cycle of 3 years and then close down. So would you like to kind of like share your thoughts and response on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Devesh. Really good question. And I comment, I can't really do anything but agree with you about this. With Mini, we weren't really setting out to study aggregation by itself, the merits and demerits of the way aggregation has been run in India and many other parts of the world. That was not our research objective. We were taking aggregation rather, or a successful aggregation scheme as a starting point. And then we were asking questions relating to what it means for more downstream distribution, equity in distribution, consumption, and so on, given that there's so much excitement around aggregation and so much mainstreaming of it in policy. But you're absolutely right. I completely agree that it's very easy to get excited about it and put in place an aggregation scheme that might not in the end up being successful. And there's a lot of deep thinking and programming to be done to get that exactly right so that it actually has a good chance of working. And there is still a way to go yet, I think. There's so much excitement around it now and so many FPOs coming up. And as you rightly point out, many of them fly for a few years and then they just sort of come down after a while, simply because the incentives weren't right or there were certain aspects of the programming that weren't quite right. So I completely agree with you. And that this is potentially perhaps something that you guys in IFPRI are thinking about. I know that Torina was thinking about aggregation perspectives as well. So there's other groups working on this, obviously, but it is something that is quite important and needs to be thought about more. And that's why it would have been quite interesting to hear Dr. Balamurugan's take on it, obviously as a person who is dealing with it on the front line, as it were, in Bihar. But hopefully we will get a chance to hear about the Bihar experience sometime down the road. So there was another question. Sorry, Namita, what was the next one?
Yeah, so there's a question from Deepak that there has been concern about market approaches to food policy as seen with the farmer protests. So how does this fit with the thoughts that you have presented?
Yes, hi Deepak. That's a great question as well. It's to note, of course, that the farmer protests, when they came with the market-focused, deregulated market-focused reforms that came in, a lot of it had to do with staples, a lot of it had to do with very mainstream crops, and the deregulation of the markets relating to them. Whereas fruits and vegetables have, of course, been almost entirely dealt with by the fairly deregulated market, the free market, as it were, for a long time. So in a sense, the fruit and vegetable markets actually provide a template to what is coming down the road, the way in which they're working right now, especially in Bihar, where things have been deregulated for quite a long time, provides a template for what we might observe in other parts of the country. And that's one of the things we're trying to highlight, is that things that are really important to consumption, like this large market pool that we're talking about, we need to get that right. We cannot always be focused on the producer side of the equation in terms of fruits and vegetables, especially being so important as a nutrition providing commodity. It is absolutely essential that we get the consumption equity aspects right. And really what Mini is trying to do is think about how markets that exist can be that governments can work with these markets to make them more equitable in terms of their consumption perspectives, how they can be supported and how they can be complemented by government policy and other actions so that they can become more nutrition sensitive and equity sensitive in that respect. So yes, I think it's very much the lessons from Mini are quite worth considering in the light of the farmer protests and so on. There was another question about, I think, about the data being collected. This is from Vinay, I think. From the data being collected before COVID, do you have any sense of how the pandemic may have changed the benefits and role of aggregations like Loop? Now, obviously, that's also a good question. I haven't been able to be on the ground. Mini hasn't been working in the ground during COVID. But it is not hard to see that, certainly from a disease control perspective, aggregation offers certain advantages in the sense that the intermingling of people at a market level, individual farmers going to the market and transacting at the market is lessened by some sort of group level action. And so there is obviously from a disease control perspective, there is a positive that comes out there. Now certainly, and especially in contexts where the markets have been quite severely curtailed as a result of COVID. For example, farm gate traders not being able to do this kind of business that they did before. Aggregations had a role to play, step in and play there. It's also interesting to see that something resembling collective action. There are lots of stories emerging around groups of farmers organizing themselves through WhatsApp groups and so on, and doing something resembling collective marketing, something resembling aggregation to get product out to the market. And to the people when the going is tough, as with COVID. So, so in a sense, aggregation is quite interesting from the pandemic perspective as well. You've also asked, how can we use these learnings and experiences received from Mini in broader perspective and at community level? Yes, great question. I think what we hope Mini will do is train focus on the consumption end of things, and particularly equity in consumption. And here we are predominantly looking at spatial equity. So, equity across space. There are forgotten parts of the country, the smaller towns, the semi-rural areas and so on, who nobody really thinks that much about. A lot of excitement around urban markets, accessing urban markets. And so things like aggregation, pushing things out to these larger markets. So really stepping back and thinking about how do we serve consumption in the more forgotten areas, in the smaller markets, which are less lucrative, which things like aggregation will bypass for the most part. How do we actually design something that will enable these equity perspectives to come in? So that's the broader lesson that we're hoping to spread through Mini. And certainly at the community level, again, thinking about consumption at the community level, we've been focused, we always focus on the production level so much in food-related interventions in India and agriculture-related interventions in India, but actually thinking about community-level consumption and how markets can serve these communities better and more equitably is something that we need to give a lot more thought to. So yes, thank you for these questions.
Thank you, Bhavani. I think there are a couple of questions that Greg is going to answer, speaking them out here. So there's a question that this model is based on Bhojpur district and how applicable are the results to wider Bihar and India more broadly? And also, why did you model over a 10-year period and not longer?
Sure, well, thank you. They're both great questions, and perhaps I can take those together because they both look at kind of the fundamental kind of challenge of designing a model, of coming up with where to study and sorry, yeah, well, sorry. 2 seconds, sorry. My laptop wasn't plugged in and I had an absolute disaster. We are now all good. Sorry. So they both point to the kind of fundamental tension of having to design a model of the data that you have available, trying to make it as realistic as possible, whilst at the same time trying to keep findings as generalizable as possible. So with Bhojpur district, we saw there was a well-defined structure of smaller market environments, which were competing with a larger market. And this is relatively common, for Bihar, where it may be in Muzaffarpur district or Nalanda district with Bihar Sharif, for example. So in these sorts of market structures and value chain structures, at least in Bihar, this is relatively common. And of course, these results where we have these market structures can be transferable. And of course, the model itself, if we were to study different districts, then the numbers would be slightly different. But I think overall, the key kind of patterns and trends would be similar. And as you see in the paper we have published, we've done a lot of sensitivity analysis to try and understand exactly what if we change certain elements of the model, what implications does that have for the outcome. So of course there will be slight differences, but overall, we hope some kind of major generalizable outcomes. Also, then in terms of why looking at 10 years, again, another great question, and we could have perhaps gone longer into the future, perhaps introduce some scenarios of perhaps climate change or crop productivity change over time. Alternatively, to begin with, we started with only 3 or 4 year simulations, and we were finding actually some of the scenarios didn't really diverge at all. So we kind of found this 10-year period as a bit of a kind of a sweet spot between the data we had available, the confidence we have in the model, and also then the confidence that significant drivers external to the system in terms of climate, in terms of demographic change, they perhaps would remain relatively stable over this 10-year period. So I'd be more than happy to expand on that in the Q&A box. I'm sorry for having to jump off, but now I'm all plugged in. And yeah, sorry.
No worries. And we do have a couple more questions. And we've also got Devesh who's raised his hand. I think perhaps we can take one question right now, and we will have a Q&A session after all the presentations are over as well. So maybe I'll ask Devesh to ask his question. And others, please keep typing your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that we address them towards the end of the webinar as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I just I just was trying to understand the kind of the loop model, right? So one of the questions which I had, which I think Greg actually responded to it, but because in all the aggregation model that we see, and we either said that, in the earlier question that we probably have to look at so many of the failures that are there. And so what we have identified from our research, one of the prime reasons for the failure of these models, of aggregation models, is that there's so much focus on distribution of value, how much farmer gets and, what is the return to farmers. And that kind of a model, from a pure industrial organization perspective, or it's not going to scale up, it's not going to be sustainable. So I just wanted to see that, so that the key to that when you do the creation of value is product differentiation, right? And so either through grading, certification, or from your nutrition value that you can credibly communicate to the buyer and so on. So I just wanted to, from that presentation that Vani did, I was just trying to look at that. What is the creation of value element in this whole arrangement? What is the product differentiation component in this arrangement that, fine in short run for 1 shot, 2 shots, you can see that this, but to be scaling up or to be sustained, we need a kind of organized system of where there will be some product differentiation and creation of values. I just wanted to pick your brain on what is the idea on that front in this arrangement. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I can come in, and Greg, if you want to add anything, you can do so as well. Devesh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Actually, this is a question that I think it's fair to say that Digital Green and Loop themselves are pondering quite hard, is where do we go from here? So how does Loop become something else, and how, having initially put this forward and had a measure of success with it, what is that bit which is, we're doing a lot of different things, and what is that bit which will enable us to, what is that bit that sets us apart that we can just sort of take forward in the next stage of Loop? And I know that Rick and others have been pondering this for quite a while. So this is something that I think there's a very live question from the Loop aggregation perspective as well. And so this is doubtless something that we will be hearing much more about as DG reformulates its plans about Loop. So Greg, do you have anything to add to that?
So I think it was another question we had in the Q&A around the role of Loop in the value chain. And one of the key reasons how Loop scaled up initially was the role of subsidization, which of course we try to look at a little bit around how sustainable that may be. But then also, you showed during the value chains talk there, Bhavani, around how villages at significant distance, 40, 50 kilometers often, away from the larger markets in Bhojpur district, are able to send their produce to these larger urban markets. And that in itself for farmers who previously had to rely upon cycling to the local mandi, or walking, or relying upon a slightly higher priced transporter, or selling to a slightly more exploitative farm gate trader, that in itself has brought some value. Now, of course, as the subsidy kind of declined over time, then so did participation. So I completely agree with Devesh, that key question of how to sustain both aggregation longer term, as well as generating the nutritional benefits is something which perhaps still remains a question. And I guess that is a limitation of our study, where we have looked at district level. Of course, if you want to go to scale this up to the whole of Bihar and beyond, then of course there are additional challenges there.
Thanks, Bhavani. Thanks, Greg. I think we'll move on now to a pre-recorded presentation by Dr. Gregory Cooper, who will be sharing some initial insights on the causes of food loss in Bihar, which has been derived from a series of interviews with horticulture value chain participants over the past 3 months. So can we have the video, please? Also, I know there are questions that we haven't answered yet. We will definitely answer those towards the Q&A, in the Q&A session that happens towards the end of the webinar. And please continue asking those questions there.
Okay, well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the next presentation of the Mini Project Virtual Dissemination Workshop. For the next 7 minutes, I'm going to be presenting some of the initial work from the food loss component of the Mini Project. We've been looking at some of the causes of food loss across the horticultural value chain of Bihar, some of the ways in which aggregation may help to overcome some of these challenges. So why are we interested in food loss? We know that by 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals aim to end global hunger and malnutrition, but at the same time, up to 1/3 of food, which is good for human consumption, is never actually consumed by humans. And we know that Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 aims to cut food losses in half by 2030, and that India is supporting this initiative. In turn, we know that food loss issues are significant in India, reflecting insufficient infrastructure, highly seasonal prices and availabilities, and also demands. And in Bihar, which is of course one of the major fruits and vegetable producers in India, there's been a very little study of the food loss issues. There's been a small number of commodity-specific studies, but in terms of taking a food systems lens and an approach to the issue of food loss, as far as we are aware, there is next to nothing. So as a consequence, we are interested in understanding the different causes perceived by the different value chain actors. We're also interested in thinking about the ways in which aggregation through systems such as Loop may help to reduce food losses. and then think about the types of interventions and policies which can help to overcome food losses within the wider food system. So this work is still very much kind of ongoing, but to give you an idea of the methods we have been taking, of course, because of the COVID situation, we have conducted a series of semi-structured interviews with various value chain participants. And we are really fortunate to have our good friend and colleague Amitesh Anand of Digital Green in Patna conduct and manage these interviews. And really they focused on the perceptions of food losses, or the causes of food losses at different parts of the value chain, the role in which aggregation may help to play to reduce food losses, and then the current and potential future interventions and ways in which we can manage food losses within the value chain. In turn, we use a technique known as purposive text analysis to take the transcriptions of the interviews and turn them into causal relationships where there are distinct causal drivers and outcomes, in order to then design causal loop diagrams which map these causal relationships across the system space. And you can imagine if we then start to do this across all of the different interviews, you can then come up with quite complex causal loop diagrams which identify different feedbacks and leverage points to then work within the system to reduce food losses. And then just to give you some of the initial insights coming from this work over the next couple of minutes, the first is that we have this word cloud here of some of the major causes of food loss identified by the different participants. And what's really interesting for me is the role in which, the importance of which variables external to the Bihari food system, so the weather, cold weather, rainfall, and exposure to heat, play in the perceptions of farmers of driving food loss and spoilage. And this is interesting, because farmers are only able to take precautions against the weather and the season. They can't change it themselves. And second, knowing what we know about potential scenarios for climate change, increasing temperatures, more erratic rainfall volumes, these drivers are more likely to become more important in future. In turn, we were able to identify benefits of aggregation in terms of helping to reduce food losses. Farmers and aggregators and also traders spoke how aggregation can help to increase the volumes being sent to market, reduce the volumes being left at the farm and going to waste. Also, the relative security of transport, for example, and the reduced transportation costs. And these can go on to increase the volumes being sent to the market, which of course can then lead to higher sales and better profits, which can then feed back to aggregation participation and fruits and vegetable production over the more long term. However, there were also some trade-offs identified, how the aggregators and transporters don't actually own the produce that they are sending to the market, and this can reduce their care in handling and loading. And also, if aggregation sites are far away from farms, this can then lead to complexities and delays, which then have a knock-on effect on the prices and profits and the wastage of fruits and vegetables in the markets. And lastly, there is then a series of different interventions which we've been able to take out from the interviews, some of which farmers are already practicing around protecting their produce using quite traditional rudimentary forms from bad weather and disease outbreaks. But really, they would like to see more information available around weather forecasts and disease forecasts, which I think Digital Green is really getting into as we speak. In turn, we see that that in terms of transportation and also market actors as well, we see a lot of what is known as jugaad, so people just doing the best they can to reduce food losses, through pieces of cloth or traditional forms of bags and crates, or using ceiling fans, for example, to try to cool down produce in storage. But really, these stakeholders would really like to see more entry of private players or government players to be able to set up and establish infrastructure such as cold storage, refrigerated trucks, market information systems to help to not only improve their decision making in terms of sending produce to markets, but also helping to increase shelf lives as well of the produce. And lastly, just of the three consumers that we interviewed, one of the key factors was fridge ownership and how this can help to store raw fruits and vegetables, but also help to store and reuse leftovers. And this really came out as a critical finding, at least so far in our preliminary analysis. So really just to leave you with this and say thank you very much for listening. And actually it appears, as we all know, the issue of food loss in places like Bihar is super complex, involving a number of different actors and feedbacks and complexities. But we hope that our modeling as we develop this will help to identify where we can intervene within the system, how we can do this, and potential trade-offs and benefits for farmers and consumers alike. So I'm really looking forward to your questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for the presentation. We now have a presentation which is external to the mini project, but within the broader landscape of improving nutrition in the regions of fruits and vegetables production. Mr. Kirtibhushan Pani from Pradhan will be sharing with us about their intervention to promote horticulture production clusters in the tribal regions in Orissa, India. Kirtibhushan Pani has been with Pradhan since 1997. By training, he is an agricultural engineer and has over 2 decades of experience promoting agriculture-based livelihoods. He is currently leading various projects and Pradhan's operations in Orissa. So can we please have his presentation?
Welcome to the presentation. I'm Kirti, representing from an organization called Pradhan. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share our experience. I will share here the experience of promotion of agriculture production clusters, especially on horticulture crops in tribal regions of Orissa. This is supported by Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, a project called ASA, and it is a government initiative, and there are NGO partners also in this project. And if I share about the background of this project, largely this project is taken up in an area with high concentration of low-income group with an acute poverty in this region. Most of the people, predominant source of livelihood is agriculture, and 83% of them are small and marginal farmers. And there is a predominance of scheduled tribe and scheduled caste in the region, and acute malnutrition is prevalent in that region. And if we look at the women's role in farming, they are actively engaged in farming. However, because of they don't have resource ownership and also patriarchal thought, society don't perceive them as owner or as a manager, whether they are perceived as a laborer. At the same time, in this region, the topography is undulating and people practice monocropping. However, looking at the agroclimatic condition, it is much more favorable to take up horticultural crops in this region. This region is also deficit zone of these crops, and mostly from distant, actually these crops come to the local as well as the regional markets. Therefore, it creates a kind of situation to create clusters to fit the local as well as the regional markets. This region's infrastructure is poorly developed. Therefore, it is important to develop the infrastructures like irrigation, mechanization in a cluster manner, which can actually support these clusters to sustain or intensify. Similarly, significant income gain has to be a key driver to sustain as well as to meet the aspiration of smallholders in the current context. And in these regions, supply chain is broken and market penetration is also very low. Therefore, there is a need for building ecosystem for input, output, finance, so which can provide assurance and sustenance. Looking at this background, a project is launched by Government of Odisha titled Promotion of Agriculture Production Cluster in Tribal Regions of Odisha, focusing largely on horticultural crops. And it is designed in such a way so that it can sustainably double the income of 1 lakh small and marginal farmers in 40 tribal blocks, covering in 1 lakh small and marginal farmers in 4 years period of time. Let me actually share an audio-visual clip which shows the project components and objective of the project.
In Odisha, the Agriculture Production Cluster project is being implemented in partnership with the state government and 17 civil society organizations.
कोरापुट गोटे आमर आदिवासी अध्युषित अंचल जोटा कि आमर एपीसी थ्रू रे आम कौन करूँ ना 8टा ब्लॉक रे आम एपीसी थ्रू रे काम करूँ जोटा कि आपणकर गोटे कन्भर्जेन्सी मॉडल बा विभिन्न प्रकार डिपार्टमेंट सहित एनजीओ मैंने काम करुँच जोटा कि बीआरएलएफ फंडिंग कर अवेयरनेस अन्य फैसिलिटेशन पूर्व जो था गोटे सिस्टमेटिक वे काम कर फॉर एग्जांपल मुझे कहबी जब लिफ्ट इरिगेशन गोटे वाटर सोर्स तैयारी करूला फॉलोअप करा कथा वेजिटेबल कल्टिवेशन रे ओडिशा लिफ्ट इरिगेशन काम करूला हॉर्टिकल्चर काम करूला सॉइल कंजर्वेशन काम करूला किंतु विभिन्न जगार अलग प्रकार भाव काम करते किंतु जितेबाला एबे एपीसी आरंभ है से कौन है ना सबू डिपार्टमेंट गोटे जगार कन्भर्जेन्स होगी काम कले।
Thank you. So, as you saw in the movie, these are the kind of components which actually is helping to set up production clusters. Largely, it is on promoting producer collectives and also selecting winner crops as per the market requirement, smallholder suitability, and agroclimatic compatibility. Looking at these three things together, we need to identify the crop, and around that winner crop, it has to be synchronized so that it can produce in a scale to have surplus so that market can reach to the doorstep. And the other livelihood assets like irrigation, mechanization has to be created in a cluster manner to sustain this effort. And these regions, most of the families actually rear goat and backyard poultry. It is planned to have adopt improved practices so that it can augment income of the families. And while developing the cluster, it is important to have market interventions, especially on primary processing, grading, sorting, and packaging, and also different market channels so that farmer can get better price and market linkage can be done better. And as I had mentioned before, it is important to build ecosystem around input, output, finance, technology, and it is available to the farmers. In this also private sector has been planned to collaborate with. And similarly, this kind of initiative requires government, NGO, and private sector partnership. Just to conclude, horticultural crop diversification along with intensification can be a game changer for this region by providing more income and additional nutritional requirement for the families. Second, this is a model by which one can create a decentralized cluster for vibrant rural economy, which meets the requirement of consumer as well as producer, and also it provides fresh and safe produce in the local area. Third is we understand the market interventions which can actually meet both the requirement of the consumer as well as producer by providing quality input availability and different marketing channels and primary processings. Fourth is developing livelihood assets in a cluster manner can be a significant enabler for this region. And fifth is building ecosystem around input, output, and finance. Thanks for your time. I'll be happy to clarify if you have any questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Please, put in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to these questions after the next presentation. So while Mini's main focus has been on horticulture in India and Bangladesh, a segment of the project has also been studying poultry interventions in an African setting in Ghana. Next up, we have a presentation from Dr. Carl Rich on Mini's poultry work. Dr. Carl Emrich is a co-principal investigator of the Market Intervention for Nutritional Improvement Project and leads the foresight modeling and policy team at the International Livestock Research Institute. His research applies quantitative and participatory systems models in the context of agriculture and livestock value chains. He holds PhD and MSc degrees in agricultural economics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Another reminder that all the panelists and researchers of the mini project are with us on this webinar. So please share your questions and they'll be more than happy to respond. So can we please have Dr. Karl's presentation?
Good morning. Today I'd like to talk a little bit more about some extensions from some of the work in Mini, trying to understand whether aggregation systems such as Loop have other roles outside the fruit and vegetable sector. It's probably useful to recap some of the benefits of aggregation systems that we've seen from Mini in our example in Bihar. One of the benefits is to reduce transactions costs so that farmers can add value by saving time and on different sorts of costs. We've seen that there are also potential benefits to consumers in terms of availability, although this is very much dependent on the various types of interventions that are available. There are also specific benefits that perishable goods, such as horticultural ones, have through an aggregation system such as Loop. Now, one question to ask is whether a system like Loop is only amenable for fruits and vegetables. And so to understand this, it's useful to try to understand some of the characteristics of fruits and vegetables. So one is that they're short cycle. They often have they have very short seasons. They tend to be very high value. They're perishable. And so perishable products often put a premium on optimal ways of trade and aggregation. They're subject to post-harvest losses in distribution and trade. And so systems like Loop, again, can help to add value by managing these losses. There's also nutritional benefits in terms of micronutrients and vitamins that are provided by fruits and vegetables, and they're accessible to a range of different types of farmers. And so a question here is whether or not there are other parallels for expansion in different products. One area that may be suitable for is in poultry. And so poultry we consider as a potential product for similar reasons as in fruits and vegetables. They are short cycle, especially in more commercialized forms. They're potentially high value, especially when local varieties are leveraged for their niche or indigenous value. They're perishable. Poultry don't last forever, and as a result are similar to fruits and vegetables in this manner. They're very much subject to post-harvest losses if we consider the prevalence of animal disease. They have important nutritional benefits in terms of vitamins and micronutrients. And backyard poultry in particular are accessible to a range of different types of producers. And so in Mini, we've done some exploratory work to try to understand whether or not poultry could be a focus of a system like Loop. And we've done this in the context of backyard poultry in Ghana. This work links to some work that we're doing at ILRI with the USAID Innovation Lab on Poultry Genetics, where the idea of this project is to try to develop a Newcastle-resistant backyard chicken and to provide ways of developing incentives for producers to uptake this. So here we're trying to understand different types of business models to leverage this technology, as well as to understand the different types of system characteristics and where a program like Loop may fit in, both for farmers, as well as to understand the issues of access and nutrition. And so you can see here on the right, our model looks at the interactions between production, marketing, consumption, as well as various aspects associated with disease, livelihoods, and gender. Our approach here is going to take an exploratory assessment. So unlike the work that we've seen in Bihar, here we're looking at things a bit more qualitatively to get a better sense of what the system is, what its characteristics are, and to assess the appropriateness of something like Loop. One of the exciting parts of this work has been the use of innovative participatory tools based on the various COVID-19 restrictions that are out there. And so here we've used a set of very innovative offline and online tools to engage with a set of experts in the poultry sector of northern Ghana. Our end product here is a stock and flow diagram, which helps us to identify feedbacks between different system characteristics, to flag various pitfalls, and to identify potential leverage points for change. Now our model is a big spaghetti diagram like the one in front of you. And this model here provides us an overview of the interactions between different components of the system. In the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail, but I will zoom in terms of how this model works, in terms of understanding areas of aggregation. And so here, models of aggregation, the role that contractual forms and other governance forms might play, as well as information and other types of aspects of the marketing system that a system like Loop would engage in. We consider areas about aspects in terms of policies and livelihoods, and we try to understand different types of interventions associated with credits, with training, and the idea of trying to get farmers more capital. We look at issues of disease and predation that's quite commonplace within the backyard system in Ghana. And finally, trying to understand areas of demand, especially both locally as well as outside of the northern part of Ghana. In terms of some key findings, one is to try to figure out ways to break the low-level productivity traps that exist in the current system. One of the things that we've found is that, based on various limits in terms of technology, in terms of knowledge, as well as disease managements, there are a number of productivity traps, and these are reinforced by poor policies, limited access of private enterprise, as well as having subsidized imported feed. And so one of the things we found is we can overcome some of these types of obstacles. We can address some of these by improving the policy environments or improving private sector access. We may actually be able to address these productivity traps. Second, and similar to Bihar, is a need for more multiple interventions. That we cannot look at aggregation alone, but it has to look at in the context of issues of disease, trade, and marketing. And finally, the issue of regional trade is very important. There's extremely high demand coming from southern Ghana, and so focusing primarily on the north at the exclusion of understanding what's happening in the south may limit our ability to intervene. And so we have to take a much more holistic approach. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that presentation. I'd now like to invite Dr. Sunita Kadiala to give us her views on the key policy messages arising from MINI, as well as potential research directions to further uncover insights for nutritionally sensitive food systems and value chain intervention. Dr. Sunita Kadiala is a professor of global nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Alongside her work as a co-investigator on MINI, she's also the principal investigator of both the Upscaling Participatory Action and Videos for Agriculture and Nutrition, UP1 project, and Innovative Methods and Metrics for Agriculture and Nutrition Actions, IMANA program. Her research focuses on the intersection between food systems and food security, health, and nutrition. She holds a PhD from Tufts University, Massachusetts. Over to you, Dr. Smith.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks the panelists for such a great set of presentations and the great Q&A session that ensued after that, and we'll have more of that. My task here is to just leave you with some key take-home messages and think of what a future policy or a research agenda might look like. So we know that interventions that address farm-level production factors to improve farm productivity and income, and household-level interventions such as nutrition gardens to improve household production diversity and maternal child diet quality, strongly show that markets play a mediating or a moderation effect on nutritional outcomes. Alongside interventions addressing production and behavioral factors at the household level, market interventions to shape nutrient-dense food production, food distribution, food environments, consumer demand, and to improve nutritional outcomes of the nutritionally vulnerable are of urgent need of the day. We heard from Professor Bhavani Shankar on why and how markets are critical for nutrition. You heard 3 presentations of what to do about it, and also a nice presentation by our colleague from Pradhan. How do we think about this challenge of rendering markets for nutrient-dense foods nutrition sensitive? And how do we generate the necessary policy-relevant evidence? You heard Dr. Greg Cooper and Dr. Carl Rich present some results of the studies from work in Bihar and Ghana on how one could work at the market level, for example, through aggregation and complementary interventions to improve farmer participation in fruit and vegetable markets and poultry interventions. And we also saw some critical trade-offs and how to offset them from these studies. Next slide, please. Could I have this? Oh, yeah, thank you. So in a nutshell, what we found or what our presenters presented us today is that the market pull is indeed quite strong. And what we also find is that aggregation services and interventions to reduce transportation costs do not mitigate this pull towards big markets. So what do we need to do about it? And we heard from Greg, for example, on the importance of combinations of synergistic interventions, which can maximize consumer-facing benefits whilst avoiding farmer-facing trade-offs. For example, we heard about the importance of improving consumer demand, importance of providing cold storage, and digitized aggregation services such as Loop to smooth predictor shortages in vulnerable markets. Carl also alluded to the potential role of credit, capital, and capacity, which might also which also resonates with some of the issues that Devesh Roy brought up in terms of how do we make these such models actually sustainable and successful, as opposed to some boutique interventions we just try and then let move on. And all this, as farmers are most interested in productivity, and we need to continue to alleviate these low productivity traps, as Carl Rich alluded to. Next slide, please. So what we need to do, and some of our policy implications we put forward through this mini project, is to embrace services such as Loop or Jivika and Jivika Stage 2. But just doing Loop and, for example, is necessary but not sufficient to improve all the things we are interested in terms of participation, improving sustainably farmers' income, improving availability and affordability of fruits and vegetables to nutritionally vulnerable markets. What do we need to do? Just as we have learned in the last 10 years on how to design nutrition sensitive agricultural interventions at the household farmstead level, we need to take and extend those principles of purposefully designing and operationalizing these kinds of market level interventions to improve nutrition outcomes. And we continue to invest in policy investments in infrastructure, financial, and human capital, for example, to reduce food loss, reduce seasonal fluctuations of availability, and reduce price volatility of nutrients-dense foods. And what we also need is a coherent set of interventions to increase the uptake of these market-based interventions. Sorry, we need coherent set of policies to increase the uptake of these interventions by the right stakeholders at the right time. Because as we know that markets come with a whole set of stakeholders, sometimes have the same set of incentives or sometimes the opposing set of incentives, and the coherence of that and staging of these interventions and policies becomes really important. For example, digitization of market might be important, and we are seeing that it has an important role to play, but it needs to be coupled with improving trust of farmers in these services, the use of information being provided, and training on how to use these resources. We need to monitor and evaluate the effects of these for ongoing improvements, and understanding who is being benefited or not benefited, not from a narrow metrics of productivity or access to markets or participation in some scheme, but really about the economic as well as nutrition and health well-being across the spectrum, not just at the mean. Next slide. Next, can you click again, please? Yeah. So, and then we need to invest in demand creation of the nutritionally vulnerable. So we need, again, as I started this slide by saying that we can draw on available robust evidence on how to design such effective interventions, both from a homestead food production and improving those kinds of interventions at the farm level. But there's also a lot more emerging evidence on how to do this from value chains and from a climate change and environmental perspective as well. Next slide, please. And that's my last one. So what could the future agenda look like? So as we said, we need to just draw on what we know and making downstream market interventions nutrition sensitive from a nascent field to a robust field in the next 5 years or so. And we need to make sure that the research and policy investments are scalable and do have nutritional impacts. How do we do that? And we thought through some of the areas for further investments, and this includes really combinations, as Greg has pointed out to us and Carl, combinations of interventions and sequencing them in a complementary fashion and ensuring there is a coherence between these interventions. As I will allude to later, markets can provide, for example, nutrient-dense foods, but markets may have high environmental footprints, but they also deliver very unhealthy foods. Therefore, we do need policy coherence in terms of making diets overall healthy and sustainable, as well, and most importantly, with a to us with a view on equity. In this case, we have talked about nutritionally vulnerable markets from a geographic sense, and that remains important. But there are also several other equity considerations that we need to take into account as we move forward to think through what market interventions would look like and how do we make them nutrition sensitive and economically sustainable and viable for all stakeholders involved. So as a environment, we just really cannot undertake any research anymore on food systems without consideration for climate change, and not just about carbon emissions, but also in terms of the water footprints and plastic footprints and all kinds of environmental concerns that we have, and as the region is grappling with those. Of course, now we have COVID, and I haven't put that, but there are any number of questions we will continue to grapple with, and that needs to be also at the front and central. Well, COVID is one of the pandemics. All projections on global health tell us that this is by no means the first or the last of this nature. We do have to think about markets producing nutrient-dense foods or enabling us to access nutrient-dense foods, but we also need to really think about how do we minimize the desirability, availability, and overall consumption of unhealthy foods. And this is where consumer demand and the way we understand consumers, which is all of us here, and create approaches that are resonant with our goals, or within just the goal of population welfare. So moving beyond top-down interventions, which might be one of the reasons why we see lots of boutique projects showing good results but abandoned later, to more citizen-driven ones to ensure contextually appropriate, relevant, and scalable interventions that will enable the consumers as well as other actors along the value chain to interact and co-design and co-evaluate these kinds of interventions. Thank you very much. I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Sunita, for bringing all the findings results nicely together in your presentation. I'd actually now like to give Dr. Gregory Cooper, Dr. Carl Rich, and Dr. Sunita, and Mr. Kirti Bhushan Pani time to respond to some of the questions that have come up. I think the first question that we're going to take here is for Mr. Kirti from Vinay, which is regarding the horticulture production clusters in Orissa, which is a great model developed by Pradhan. And as of now, many of the SRLMs are also promoting farmer producer groups in many states. So his question is how these HPC, APCs are different from the FPO, FPGs, and don't you think it will create an additional layer of institution for the SHG members Mahila Kisans. So over to you, Mr. Bhushan.
Thank you, Binay. It's a great question actually you have asked, and with the actually this question becomes very significant with the 10,000 APO guideline also. See, basically, what is important is, see, this APC model is a building block for the success of APOs. So here also in the model itself, what we have done, that there are actually NRLM, Agriculture Department, Horticulture Department, and also Water Resource Department. They have come together. I will not say this is also an aggregation model and farmer aggregation model, but the other factors, generally, if you look at, there are many APOs has been found. So if we actually look at why it has not succeeded largely and what are the major issues, because we have not actually really addressed the issues of farmer. So unless until, see, the kind of context what we are actually into, and in Odisha, the areas where we are working, the problem is multifaceted. Like if we only aggregate, because they are subsistence farmers. So first they have to be actually graduated from a subsistence farmer to a producer, then to a maybe a proficient and commercial producer. So to do that, then APO actually it will be vibrant and it will work and the business can run. So unless until that kind of model and this cluster, as we are saying here, cluster is around largely around paddy or cereal crops. Now actually unless until cluster is evolved, it will be difficult to actually bring to a commercial scale, and other actors cannot come into that. So that's an important aspect, and with that thought only this model, this project is conceived, that let key factors of farmers come together and other departments has come together, and it has an APO component also. So that's how actually HPC model or APC model is different than the APO. But I think this has to be, these factors need to be come together, and we need to design in all the NRLMs and other parts so that we can actually bring a significant change. It is more important to have a significant gain at the farmers level so that you can double the farmers income or can give a significant return to the farmers. So I hope I shared that question, Binay, as you have said. And also related to this, there was a question, Namita, like people are asking about the convergence. Actually, it's saying something is very easy, but actually doing it in the ground and in a government setup, there are actually challenges. But I think there is no other way out. So we need to work around it. And there are actually some mechanisms through this project we have actually learned through. And that's what is you, when we are saying about scaling up, I think scaling up starts from the beginning of design itself. So if we are actually trying to do it, and there are actually different committees we have constituted where government, NGO, private sector, they have come together at the state level, district level, then block level, and that kind of actually more discussion, interaction, and coming up with different circulars which can actually in a regular manner address the issues of convergence, that works. This is one I will say. Second, and also creating a political will in the state level. See, basically here government showed an interest of this kind. So that is also very important to pitch into. But I will say there are still struggles because of some guidelines, some policies, but we need to work together. There are issues of timeliness, quality also. So those parts also gradually need to be improved. So these are the two questions. And shall I respond another question which was around, it's a very important one, on the market force which we are sharing. See, basically my view is we need to have better market intelligence, and it is to be dynamic. And I'm certainly just answering that. See, basically gradually we are also experiencing that our region with a 200-kilometer radius is a local area economy zone. If we can actually plan, there are a lot of possibilities. And but only thing is you need to have a macro market understanding, and we need to synchronize market information in the production and to be evolving as dynamically as it emerges. So these are the quick thoughts I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. The couple of questions which I'll request Greg to answer. One is about the food waste data, and would that allow you to make a model that can run future scenarios? And another question is from Devesh Roy on whether the loop system, particularly at scale, needs a complementary intervention of farmer registry. And how do we get traceability and minimizing of free-riding problems? So if you could briefly answer these two.
Sure. So in terms of the data requirements to make this, a model quantitative and running scenarios, the key thing is that a qualitative model, sets the foundations to understand what are the causes and the feedbacks, and actually kind of highlight the value chain structure. However, we know that there is a real lack of quantitative data in terms of prices, volumes, qualities in Bihar. One of the beauties of the Loop dashboard data set is that it actually helps to highlight some of these key time series. So that's, in order to design a quantitative model which looks like the real system beyond just a simple toy model, we would need to collect more quantitative data. And like the likes of the FAO, for example, are starting to collect more food loss quantitative data, but there's still some way to go there. So thank you for that question. The second one around farmer registry and a complementary intervention. When farmers participate in Loop, even though there are no participation criteria, you can have any land size, any volumes produced. However, there is no criteria. Yet when a farmer does supply Loop for the first time, then they are kind of informally registered into the Loop dashboard data set, and you can then have a record of their market participation and the volume supplied and so on. And they all contribute a transportation cost relative to the volume supplied. So of course, some farmers will be supplying more and be contributing more, others less. So there is this element of registration and transparency. But of course, if that was to become even larger, even more scaled, then of course issues of free riding could become a larger issue.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. I'll take next question, which is for Carl, asking, is the smallholder chicken value chain in Ghana very different to the one in Bihar? Carl, could you answer that, please?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In general, backyard value chains tend to be similar, across the world, in terms of their organization, in terms of their fragmentation, in terms of the various constraints that they face in terms of predation and disease and so on. So there are a lot of similarities between what we see in Ghana, what we see in Bihar. Where there might be some differences, I think this is something we would want to explore more, are the relative influences that semi-commercialized and commercialized value chains play alongside backyard chains. And so that's something that will differ a bit. My sense in India is that there's a bit more commercialization of poultry, more contract farming, and more areas of potential competition vis-a-vis the backyard sector. And that has increased quite a bit over time in India over the past decade plus. Whereas in Ghana, things remain at a relatively low level in general. And so I think if you look at poultry across different value chains from the spectrum of backyard versus commercialized, the share of commercialized production has been growing quite a lot in India vis-a-vis Ghana. So there are some certain differences that I think are important to flag. Maybe one thing just to expand a little bit on in response to a couple of the questions in the chat that I answered earlier. One of the things that's been very nice about this process in Ghana is trying to understand aggregation before putting something like that into place. And so Greg alluded to this earlier in one of his responses, but what's nice about it in using this kind of systems approach is that it really gives us a flavor for what the system looks like and where the different component parts are within that system, so that we can actually design something that's a bit more fit for purpose. And so what this process has done for us in Ghana is to help us flag some of the potential constraints to aggregation and to develop, before designing any sort of aggregation system in itself, a variety of complementary approaches that work together as a package. And so this is something that came up very strongly in the results on fruits and vegetables in Bihar. Similar kinds of things, have come up even from a qualitative sense in our work in Ghana.
Thank you so much, Carl. We know that there are some more comments and questions which we haven't been able to answer, but looking at the time, we'll have to let them go. We'll try and address these questions in our follow-up mail, where we'll also share the recordings with you. So we'll try and put some of these answers together for you and try and address as many comments and questions have been posed, or in the remaining 15 minutes, if the researchers can type the answers instead of answering them live, that'll be great too. So I think I'm going to now hand it over to Bhavani and Dr. Srivali Krishnan to take it forward towards the closing of the workshop. Over to you, Bhavani and Srivali.
Thank you, Namita. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Srivali Krishnan. She's the last of our panelists, and she's going to give her take on what she's heard in the context of her deep knowledge of agriculture for nutrition initiatives in India. Dr. Srivali Krishnan is Senior Program Officer for Global Development in the India office of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she advises on and oversees a large portfolio of agriculture development projects and initiatives, working closely with several government agencies throughout the country. So Dr. Srivali, delighted to have you with us. Over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhavani, and a lot of the speakers today. So first of all, let me start by acknowledging that both Dr. Bhavani, the team at Mini, Greg, and the entire team, Dr. Sunita, and also the several participants from the Digital Green team on what an interesting seminar and dissemination event this was. In fact, this was one of the most interesting dissemination event I've actually seen on food systems in near future. So, first of all, congratulations and kudos to the team to really make this as an interesting learning session, but also to be able to unpack very complex issues that are facing the food system in a very simplistic way. I also have to, at this point of time, acknowledge the partnership that this team had enjoyed with Jivika and the entire government of Bihar to be able to look at the deeper issues around the food systems and how they contribute towards the overall aspect of nutrition. Now, when we talk about from the food systems perspective, one of the things that I've been constantly advocating is that are the two very important levers that basically drive the availability, accessibility, and affordability of nutritious food systems in our settings. These two levers are income and markets. And one of the most important aspects of that, which is the markets, is something that we have been able to delve a little bit deeper down through the research that the Mini team has done here, but also to also unpack that how important markets are for the income as well. So these two things are totally interconnected, and I think today's presentations from different experts here was only reinforcing that these two interconnected themes have a long and very deeper connection in terms of food systems perspective. In terms of the work that Mini team has done in Bihar, it is very clear that upgrading near farm and market infrastructure is an essential piece. I really like the whole aspect on equity aspect when we talk about from the aggregation models. But also that incentivizing production of perishable foods to increase supplies is one aspect, but it also has several policy ramifications that one has to take into consideration. I really like the presentation on reducing the food loss and waste, and thereby reducing the volatility of supplies, smoothing the access and prices, and reducing the climate and environmental footprint. And also to look at how do we improve opportunities for better diets from local markets. One of the things that this whole research has also flagged is that the absorptive capacity of rural markets is low. And it would be a great case study to understand how upgrading infrastructure in Grameen markets may change what's available to a low income consumer, as well as how improved logistics would change flows and affordability of perishable foods more broadly. Similarly, as I say, in terms of how do we move forward, one should also look at how to understand the processing might preserve foods, reduce losses, and reduce seasonal impacts of accessibility as well as affordability, and change the consumption pattern. We have several models of farm level processing. So for example, whether it is drying or solar drying, or even like basic level processing, whether it is pickling or some level of primary processing. But how does that really improve the accessibility, affordability, and changes the consumption pattern at the ground level? And overall, I feel that it is an important and a very critical piece of work, given that where we are at this point of time from the work around markets and reforms around markets in Bihar. At this point, one of the things that I was also asked to address was, where do we go from here? So one of the things that I do want to flag is, as part of a partnership with the government of Bihar, the Gates Foundation is putting together a team and a technical support to help to unpack and to be able to support the government of Bihar as it moves towards the trajectory towards improving market access, as well as reforming the market infrastructure both at the primary and secondary level, how it works with farmer producer organizations, but also looks at markets as a way of value addition system and not purely as markets. This I feel is important when we take into consideration nutrition, because when we talk about high value or highly nutritive products, we do not take them for just the way there we are comparing apples and oranges, in the sense that we do not want to compare them as purely a production oriented system, but also which is a value addition system from the nutrition aspect. In this context, I think the study is very timely and useful, as the foundation is thinking of putting together the technical support to the government of Bihar's Department of Agriculture, and slowly also looking at the Department of Animal Husbandry in terms of how we can support the overall market reforms, but also in terms of specifically looking at infrastructure at the market level. Secondly, I would also say that there are several research questions that have actually unfolded as this research has kind of come to play. And these are very, very important, but some things that probably need us to really delve a little bit deeper down. We want to also take this time to pause and to think that where are the research priorities for the Gates Foundation to really intervene, but also to support not only the state governments, but also in terms of looking at ways and means of how we can pilot and look at smaller ways of learning, but at the same time make it most iterative as possible to feed into the policy environment of both state as well as federal government. We will be back with a much more robust research agenda, as we are supporting both the federal as well as state governments in terms of integrating some of these learnings, whether it is on fruits and vegetables, the fruit loss and waste, especially what Carl had mentioned in terms of how these models of aggregation can be expanded not only to horticulture, but also to livestock products. And where is it that we would like to intervene with the policymakers and making these part of the policy agenda that the government is actually looking at. So from my perspective, I would like to say it has been a really learning day for me. I really enjoyed the presentations, but from the foundation's perspective, this is not the end. This is just the beginning of our work in this very, very important area of horticulture. We are also looking at different models, as Keerti had mentioned, in terms of aggregation and production clusters. But it is important to learn from these models, not only from the perspective of markets for income, but markets for nutrition. And I feel that the team has done a fabulous job today. And it will be, I'll be short of words to say how this will actually shape the agenda of the Gates Foundation, particularly for the work that we plan to do in India moving forward. So with that, thank you so much. And I really want to make sure that a lot of the energy that I saw in the room in terms of some of the questions that were asked, we've seen a lot of the partners and grantees participate. This is exactly what we would like to look at from the dissemination standpoint. And we hope that in near future, the mini team will have an opportunity to present it to the Jivika team as well, who have been partner for this work, but also to see how some of these learnings can be integrated with the programming of Jivika going forward. So with that, thank you so much, Bhavani and the entire team.
Thank you, Dr. Srivali. Thank you so much for those words of wisdom, and really looking forward, our team is looking forward to conversations with Jibika, with continuing talks with the Gates Foundation, and with everyone else who's attended today. Thank you, everyone. I certainly found the talks and comments and questions and responses very informative, very refreshing. I hope you also feel the same. It's clear that the time is ripe for a big push now to put perishable nutritious foods, fruits and vegetables, animal source foods, as Dr. Srivali mentioned, right at the heart of the effort to improve nutrition equitably in India. And this needs both a greater push to encourage self-provisioning, as in the Nutri-Garden project that Kirti presented, but also using markets to deliver these foods to the broader public. And we hope that in some small way, the work that we described here today will seed some of that momentum for that to happen. Thank you to all of you, to the speakers and the audience, for your contributions to this workshop. It's highly appreciated. And special thanks especially to Namita, Susan, Shiny, and the excellent comms team at Digital Green for their work in putting this workshop together. For those of you interested in knowing more about Mini, please do visit our website. The address will be available on the Q&A box. And there we will have links to our academic papers, photos, and blogs, and so on. We would like to thank you all once again for your valuable time, engaging questions. We will remain in touch with you about our over email to share the recording and the further updates for another workshop that's going to happen about the work that's being carried out in Bangladesh. But at this worrying time, we also dearly wish for the best of health for you and indeed to all of India. So thank you and goodbye.